specifics, and we will be getting down to some very specific experiences from 3 different countries. We are going to have a series of initial presentations from those speakers, and then there will be a question and answer session. There will be a question and answer session in the latter part. At any point, you can raise questions in the Q&A or chat box. The chat box may be best used for comments and exchanges, and the Q&A icon down at the bottom for formulating questions. There is interpretation available into English, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. So there's a button at the bottom of your screen saying interpretation, and you just click on that to get access to the interpretation that you need. It's going to be very important, given the complexity of some of the translation, that we speak as clearly as possible and try not to rush. I will try not to do that myself, and speak as clearly and slowly as possible. But at the same time, we need to respect the time available. Each of the speakers has a clearly allotted time, and we will ask you to keep time, and you will be notified in the chat when there is 1 minute left, but I will also be frantically waving at you when your time is up. So please respect that so that we can all get to hear from everyone who's here. So this event is part of the Global Days of Action for Debt Cancellation that has been running from October the 15th through to October the 31st. It also formed part of the Global Campaign for Education's 1 Billion Voices campaign. It's really an event where we will be launching new research on debt and education financing that's been taking place in 7 countries, and we'll hear from 3 of them. The event is co-organized between the Global Campaign for Education, the Open Society Foundations, and ActionAid International. And we're really wanting to get under the skin of the connections between debt and education, and particularly thinking about that in the context of COVID and in the context of the climate crisis. Amin, so you can hear you. Amin, please silent. Thank you. So I do think this is a really important time for a radical rethink. Some of you may have joined the collection of UN special rapporteurs who are speaking from different perspectives on education, water, housing, extreme poverty, coming together to make a reassertion of a reimagining of public services and resistance to privatization in the light of COVID and the climate crisis. That was a big event yesterday. I think we need a radical rethinking of wider macroeconomic policies, something which I've been spending a lot of time on, challenging the International Monetary Fund and ministries of finance, who are still attached to a cult of austerity. Worldwide, there is a great fear that 85% of the population of the world will be living under austerity by next year, according to the recent Global Austerity Report. One of the biggest problems with debt is that debt exacerbates the power or increases the power of the IMF, because when countries are indebted, they end up in full to and dependent on the lender of last resort, which is the IMF, and tends to mean that they become subject to the ideological agenda of the IMF, which is notoriously linked to the suppression of public spending, cuts to public sector wages in particular, and therefore undermining progress on education and other development goals. And that's particularly acute in the case of education, where the public sector workforce is such a large part of the agenda. So we want to explore how debt cancellation, debt alleviation can impact on the financing of education, thinking about these 4 S's, which is a framework which ActionAid in the Global Campaign for Education has developed, thinking about the impact on the size of the budgets, the share of the budgets going to education, the sensitivity of allocations of budgets and the scrutiny of budgets in practice, size, share, sensitivity, and scrutiny. Debt, in one way or another, can have an impact, and how one deals with debt alleviation and debt cancellation can have a dramatic impact on any one of those. And we really want to use this webinar to share some of the latest research, which I think has got us beyond some of the sort of theoretical assumptions of what is the link between debt and education, and gets us into some of the complexity of those connections and the dynamics between debt and education at country level. We will be hearing from case studies from Lebanon, Mongolia, and Zambia, and they will explore the multiple and diverse ways in which debt and education financing interplay. We also have a panel of experts, whether economists, people working on debt and education financing, who will also give their responses and their insights based on what they've heard from these case studies as well. But before we move on to our first substantive speaker, I want to pass over to Luis Eduardo Perez, who's the Policy and Research Advisor with the Global Campaign for Education, who can give us shortly some background to the research that has been conducted in recent months. Luis.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And hi, everyone. I am so pleased to be part of this panel. I'm very excited about the launch of our 7 case studies. On behalf of the Global Campaign for Education, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and the members of the panel for making time, reading and commenting our work, and for being part of this event. Well, I want to spend my 3 minutes providing the general framework in which these 7 case studies were conducted. And the first thing to mention is that in line with the strategic plan for 2019-2022, and within the frame of its 1 Billion Voices campaign, as David said, the Global Campaign for Education has designed a research initiative that really aims to explore the key factors that influence the relationship between debt, different debt mechanisms, and increasing domestic financing for education. So the initiative, which is technically and financially supported by Open Society Foundation and Action ID, comprise 3 main phases that I just quickly want to mention today. The first phase we call in the Global Campaign for Education is kind of educating ourselves. We really have been working for many years on education financing, but not had experience really working on debt. So our first step was trying to learn what is that, what is the discussion, what is debt, what are the different debt mechanisms, what is the really meaning of debt rescheduling, debt canceling, debt alleviation, debt swap for education. So we engage as a movement in trying to identify what the literature said about this and try to use this knowledge to launch our campaign and to proceed trying to influence policy at the local levels. So in this very first phase, we produce what we call about ground papers that create this space for learning between us. And the second phase, we really want to know more what happened in the reality in different contexts. And we developed 7 case studies in very different countries. El Salvador in Latin America, Lebanon in the Middle East, Zambia and Gambia in Africa, Mongolia and Nepal in Asia, and Georgia in Europe. And the question for all these 7 case studies was exactly the same. What is the possibility of debt mechanisms to increase funding for education? Under what mechanisms this opportunity will emerge? And so we partnered with 7 national coalitions, the 7 national coalitions, the 7 countries I mentioned, and we were very lucky to find specialized knowledge in those countries. And so we create partnerships with 7 local researchers who conduct interviews in some cases with key stakeholders and also gather data, fresh data, to try to explore empirically how this connection works. So in my view, what is the added value of this piece of research, or these 7 case studies that we are launching today. What we believe is that discussions about debt alleviation mechanisms and education financing tend to be based on theoretical assumptions or empirical generalizations. This means that what works in one place of the world could work for another one. We were very aware that we can do that in that way, in the sense that applying for one mechanism or another could create problems for the countries in terms of, for example, financing development in the short or the long-term future. So this research often a positive, yes, kind of stand out now new evidence to say that works, does it work in that way? And in this sense, we are providing as a movement fresh data to really add into this discussion. I am not going to say more about this because we have 3 colleagues today explaining in more detail the studies. So I will to use just 20 seconds to say something about the last phase of this piece of research. We are producing a comparative case study that will be available soon. And in this case study, we will kind of identify the key lessons, the key aspect that is probably useful for countries experiencing similar levels of debt distress. And finally, a toolkit that is intended to provide our members all across the world with a very basic tool to understanding the complexity between debt alleviation mechanisms and funding and all this stuff, and explore at the local levels if that is a possibility to use them. So sorry, it's okay. Thank you very much for your time. And yes, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Luis Eduardo Perez. Great to have that background. And I'm going to move us on quickly because before we hear from the country case studies, we're very fortunate to have with us Heidi Chow, who is the Executive Director of the Jubilee Debt Campaign. And those who haven't come across her work or the Jubilee Debt Campaign, I'd strongly recommend an excellent article in The Guardian today on debt and the climate crisis. But it's great to have you with us here to give a wider background to where we are with the debt crisis and the relevance of debt for financing education. To Heidi.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely warm welcome. And just want to say thank you to the hosts of this event for inviting me to join your global panel to discuss the findings of your research. At Jubilee Debt Campaign, we have long argued for the need for debt cancellation to address both the immediate impacts of the global South debt crisis, but also to build a more transformative approach to debt to prevent future crises. And this is more urgent than ever. The world is facing multiple intersecting crises, the pandemic, the climate emergency, and the debt crisis itself. The countries need debt cancellation to ensure that the resources that can be used to fight the climate emergency, invest in public services, social protection, healthcare, and education. You know, the very things that are so urgently needed right now to tackle these multiple crises, as well as the worsening impacts on inequality and poverty. Now, our analysis shows that even before the pandemic, 52 countries were already in debt crisis, and that includes the countries that are being covered today in this event, so Lebanon, Mongolia, and Zambia. The IMF, our definition of debt crisis is when debt repayments undermine a country's economy or its ability to provide the basic economic and social rights for its citizens. And this is in direct contrast with the World Bank and IMF definition, which only looks at the ability of a country to repay its debts. And even before the pandemic, our research showed that the growing debt burdens of lower income countries were already contributing to public sector cuts. And so of the 15 countries that were spending over 18% of their revenue on debt payments, 14 of those countries saw real public spending per person fall in the years leading up to the pandemic. And so today, government spending on debt is outstripping government spending on education. So, for example, in Mongolia, the government in Mongolia is spending 12% of its revenue on education, and that's compared with 23% being spent on external debt service. So essentially, the government spends almost double the amount on debt than it does on education. In Zambia, 24% of government revenue is spent on education, and that's compared to 34% that's going to external debt service. So Zambia spends almost 50% more on debt than it does on education. And this is essentially what debt does. It strips the ability of countries to invest in the things that matter and prioritizes repayments to creditors at the expense of basic human rights. Now, if we are to address the multiple crises that the world is facing, global South countries urgently need to be able to invest in public services, in health, in education, as well as fighting the climate crisis. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about how countries got into debt crisis in the first place. And to start with, I just want to say, from a structural point of view, our global economy has long been organized around the interests of corporations and wealthy governments who collude to maintain their economic power. And so activities such as corporate tax avoidance and evasion and illicit finance flows, repatriation of profits by multinational corporations, and unfair global trade rules have kept global South economies locked into raw material extraction and low value manufacturing, which means that countries are kept in poverty and underdevelopment and are left dependent on debt as their source of public financing for key areas like healthcare and education. So this means that the global South countries are structurally predisposed to unsustainable debt levels, and all it takes is an external shock to plunge countries into debt crisis. So after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates plummeted in the West, and so there was a boom in lending in the global South as speculators realized they could make money, more money from the global South than they could in the global North. And then in 2014, the price of raw materials fell because many countries are dependent on selling raw materials, which is a legacy from colonialism. The drop in commodity prices led to a drop in income. And so this meant that countries then had to borrow more money. And so over the last 10 years, debt payments have increased by 85%. And then when COVID hit, another external shock, immediately the Chinese economy slowed down, followed by Western economies. And once again, commodity prices fell and money moved out of the global South in the largest recorded capital outflow, and interest rates went back up again. And then lockdowns in the West meant that remittances dropped off, which is a really important source of income for people in the global South. So that's an overview of how we got ourselves into this crisis. So what's been done about it? Well, in response to the crisis, the G20 set up a scheme to suspend debts temporarily. However, this only provides a temporary breathing space, with suspended repayments actually coming due in the next few years on top of what is going to be due then anyway. So instead of solving the crisis, actually it just delays it. And so the scheme also fundamentally does not compel private creditors to participate. And this is a huge problem for a country like Zambia, where 69% of its total debt is owed to private creditors. So these like banks and hedge funds. And so essentially it makes the suspension scheme essentially ineffective for a country like Zambia. And as private creditors are not being forced to come to the table to negotiate, they are effectively they've been kept being repaid throughout the pandemic, profiteering from their loans. Meanwhile, governments struggling to face the pandemic, provide healthcare, decent education, social protection to its citizens at this time of crisis. The G20 also set up the common framework for debt treatments, which has again also not compelled private sector participation, and has also not offered any new tools to make that happen. It also ignores multilateral debt relief and leaves out middle income countries. And the 3 countries that have applied so far, Chad, Ethiopia and Zambia, have seen none of their debt cancelled so far. And again, the private creditors have not taken part. So we believe the fastest way to keep money in global South countries during this multiple crisis is to tackle for immediate cancellation of debt payments for countries that request it. And we also need to make private lenders take part in debt cancellation. And there are a number of options to doing this, including passing legislation and creating a fair and transparent debt restructuring process at the UN. And if we can introduce some of these measures, we believe that we can take steps towards averting future debt crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And it's so important to recognise that the scale to which spending on debt servicing is outstripping spending on education in so many countries now. Really shocking. And I think with COP coming up, it is worth flagging what you actually flag, I think, in the article today, which is that 2/3 of the climate financing that people are talking about is coming in loan forms, and therefore a lot of this climate finance risks exacerbating the debt crisis, because even if they're low interest loans, they are in one way or another force countries to repay and add to the debt burden. And it's just irresponsible for that to be the case when commitments really should be for grants. So lots more to be done. Now, I think that gives us a great picture of the overall environment within which the connections between debt and education work. What we want to do now is move to the first of the 3 country studies, and we're going to go to Zambia first of all, and we're going to hear from George Hamusunga, who is the Executive Director of ZANEC, the Zambian National Education Coalition, and hoping to hear from you, George, details of the research findings in Zambia. We can see the presentation, we can't hear your voice, George. George, are you there? We can't hear you.
Hello, I'm there.
Lovely, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to present some highlights of the findings of the debt and education financing study that we conducted in Zambia with the support of Action Aid and GCE. Okay. Now, one thing I need to mention is that following the HIPIC or highly indebted poor country initiative that took place between 2006 and 2015, and that took place in early 2000, we saw an improvement actually in the economic progress for Zambia as a result of the debt being forgiven. We saw poverty rates, reducing from 64% to 60% by 2010, and we saw also a lot of increase in the budgetary allocation to education over the period, reaching the peak of support towards education in the year 2015, when Zambia, was allocated about 20.2% of the overall national budget. But from 2016 to date, we have seen a declining investment in the education sector against, the massive accumulation of debt. And as a result of that, we see that the new government, when it came into office in 2011, it started reversing all the gains we were making around after HIPIC, which included, reduced borrowing, which included prudence in the management of the economy. But we saw them actually, borrow quite a lot. And from 2011, our debt, for instance, was around 3.5 billion or 15% of GDP. But by 2020, it had risen to 11.97 billion. And in 2020, we also failed to make the first repayment on the 42.5 million euro bond. So we are, of course, expected to start paying substantial repayments in 2022, but the situation is not bright that we'll be able to make those payments. Now, the government has not made any real attempt at reducing the debt stock, meaning that they have devised, of course, measures, one of them being the medium-term debt management strategy. And this focus on managing the risk exposure that is embedded in the debt portfolio, particularly possible variations in the cost of debt servicing and its impact on the budget, and in particular, detecting how cost and risk vary with the composition of the dates. Now, based on the strategy, you may wish to know that government took some of the measures in 2018, which include, development projects that are below 80% had their financing, suspended. They cut down on ministerial travel. They ordered cancellation of some existing loans and banned the issuance of letter of credit and guarantees for state-owned enterprises. And this measure led to some positive outcomes with reduced debt growth rates, less than, of course, 15% recorded in 2018. But this has not helped so much as, the debt sustainability analysis, for instance, still noted that the total public debt was projected to increase in the future despite these measures. Now, in October 2020, or a month before defaulting the Eurobond,
1 minute, George.
The government announced some intentions to implement liability management exercise and to suspend and to request, their approval from creditors to suspend debt service payment for a period of 6 months. Now, all this really has not helped so much. Now we have a new government, of course, and the education sector is bearing the brunt of this lack of resources due to date. But the new government actually is committed to ensuring that this is addressed by way of renegotiating it with the date repayments with the creditors. And this so far is going well, and the hope now is that they'll be able to succeed in the negotiations and free the resources to be able to invest, especially in the education sector, which the new government has promised to provide for free. So maybe within my constrained time, that is what I can say. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, George. Very much appreciated. And I think really, Zambia, such high levels of indebtedness, it's critically important to come up with a new, I think, global deal in order to enable Zambia to prioritize investment in education and other essential public services. But thank you very much for your short presentation. I know it's very rushed for everyone. We are asking each country to just summarize the research, much of which is very detailed research, in just 7 minutes. If you do have any questions or comments, please do use the chat box, or for questions, the Q&A box. We will be coming to here to respond to your questions shortly, or after we've heard the series of presentations. We are now going to move to Lebanon, where we have 2 speakers. Between them, they will be using 7 minutes. We have a researcher, Mr. Saleh Amin, and we have Mrs. Samar Sayoum from the Lebanese Coalition for Education. So over to Lebanon. Our colleagues, Samar, and can we hand over to you? There we are. I think we're first going to hear briefly from Mr. Saleh Amin, and then over to you, Samar Sayoum.
أستاذ أمين، يلا بس إذا بدك تعلي الصوت. إيه ما سامعين.
اوكي مش الحال. قد ايه الوقت؟ 5 دقائق. 5 دقائق.
Please make sure that you've got your interpreting on. You should have an English interpreting button or other languages for you. Over to you. Thank you.
اوكي thank you. بالنسبة مساء الخير لكم جميعا. يعطيكم العافية، وإن شاء الله تثمر جهودكم خيرا لهذه البلاد. بالنسبة إلى لبنان، الدين العام والتربية والتعليم في لبنان، للحقيقة طرأ تطورات كبيرة جدا من تاريخ ما أعددنا الدراسي إلى غاية تاريخه. الدين العام في لبنان تسبب بانهيار مالي ونقدي واقتصادي شامل، تسبب بانهيار مستوى المعيشة في لبنان. حوالي بالإجمال حوالي يعني 82% من الشعب اللبناني أصبح بخطوط الفقر. أكثر من نصف الشعب اللبناني فقر مدقع، وبالتالي تقريبا صارت الحياة يعني عم تقرب من الشلل. المتجول في شوارع بيروت وفي الشوارع اللبنانية يلحظ إقفال الكثير من المؤسسات والمحلات التجارية، حركة سير خفيفة جدا، حركة احتجاجات تكبر وتكبر في لبنان، تدهور سريع في سعر صرف العملة اللبنانية، ارتفاع كبير بسعر صرف العملات الأجنبية مقابل العملة اللبنانية، وبالتالي توقف المصارف عن دفع ودائع المودعين. كل هذا الواقع يؤثر تأثيرا سلبيا ضخما على مسألة التعليم في لبنان، لدرجة مثلا أنه لبنان كان بالعام 2018 العام الدراسي 2018-2019 كلفة التعليم في المدارس الخاصة حوالي 4 مليارات دولار، يعني 4 مليارات و150 مليون دولار، يعني بشكله حوالي بالعملة اللبنانية حوالي 6 مليارات ليرة لبنانية. أما الآن فالمؤسسات التعليم في القطاع الخاص، واللي هي بتشكل ثلثين التعليم في لبنان، تقبض أقساط المدارس إما فريش دولار، يعني بالدولار، وهذا صعب جدا. وبالتالي المواطن اللبناني أو رب الأسرة بده يحصل على الدولار بسعر السوق ب20 أو 21 ألف ليرة اللبنانية، وإذا كان عنده دولار بده يتحول بشيك مصرفي على المؤسسة التعليمية على أساس 3900 ليرة، يعني عم يخسر حوالي بين 70 و80% من القوة الشرائية للعملة الوطنية ولحساباته الموجودة في البنك بالدولار الأمريكي. معظم التعليم في لبنان اليوم صار أونلاين، يعني بالبيوت، وبالتالي لا تتوفر للأسر الأجهزة المناسبة، يعني اللابتوب والحواسيب. والأكثر من ذلك إيلاما هو أنه الكهرباء في لبنان أصبحت تقريبا منعدمة، وبالتالي بده يضطر صاحب الأسرة إلى أن يشترك بمولد كهربائي خاص، وهذه الكلفة تتراوح بين 2 و3 ملايين ليرة على بده يدفعها المواطن من دخله المحدود. معظم الأسر في لبنان دخلها هو بالليرة اللبنانية، وبالتالي أصبح مستوى الفقر المدقع حوالي 92 الفقر عفوا 92% من الأسر اللبنانية هي فقيرة، وحوالي 52% هي فقر مدقع. وبالتالي
Amin, can we pass over to Samar in a moment? We only have 2-3 minutes left for you as a whole for the Lebanon.
Samar? Hello? Hi. أنا رح أحاول أنهي. بالتالي المشكل في لبنان، مشكلة الدين العام أدت إلى انهيار شبه شامل في لبنان، وبالتالي كل النظام التعليمي في لبنان أصبح مهدد إن لم تجد الحكومة أو الأمم المتحدة أو البنك الدولي أو صندوق النقد الدولي مساعدات تذهب للأسر وبالعملة الأجنبية لإنقاذ العام الدراسي التربوي في لبنان. أنا عم بتكلم على صعيد التعليم العام الابتدائي والتكميلي والثانوي، وكذلك التعليم على المستوى الجامعي. شكرا لكم.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Nice
Do
to
you
see you as well?
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. So رح كفي بالعربي. مثل ما ذكر أستاذ أمين إنه من بعد الدراسة تدهورت قيمة الليرة اللبنانية بشكل فظيع. الأهم أهمية الدراسة في وقتها كان أنها أعطت فكرة للتكاليف التي يتكبدها المواطن اللبناني حينها. أما الآن فقد برزت مشكلة المدارس الخاصة التي ليست ضمن الكارتيلات الموجودة في مجال التعليم، لأننا اعتبرنا في الدراسة سابقاً أنه يوجد كارتيلات في التعليم تجعل الأهل بالمدارس الخاصة تجعل الأهل يدفعون مبالغ باهظة من أجل أن يتعلم أولادهم. أما الآن فإن المدارس الخاصة الصغيرة والتي يرودها أكثر أو حوالي 70% من طلاب لبنان، وهي أقساط منخفضة، حتى هذه المدارس فهي لا تستطيع أن توفر المعاش للمعلمين. هذا مهم جداً، وهي تواجه مشكلة في دفع معاشات الأساتذة، بالتالي إنها مهددة بوقف التعليم نهائياً بعد شهرين فقط، وهي أساساً تعطي يعني أقساطها متدنية، حتى الأهل لا يستطيعون أن يدفعون هذه الأقساط كما ذكر أستاذ أمين، لأن الشعب اللبناني حالياً واقع في الفقر بشكل كبير. شكراً لإصغائكم، وأنا أود أن أزيد وأقول أننا فعلاً بحاجة لإلغاء الديون. أود أن أقول فقط شيئاً واحداً، أنه وجد مبلغ 500 مليار لبنانية للمدارس الخاصة، ولكن الحكومة لم تعطها بعد للمدارس. نحن في ورطة حقيقية، والتعليم في لبنان مهدد رسمياً. لذلك نحن بحاجة إلى إعادة النظر في هذه الديون.
Thank you so much, Samar. Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to hear from Lebanon, and so different contexts, but so many of the same challenges where debt servicing is financing on education. Thank you, Amin. Thank you, Samar. Appreciate your inputs. We are now going to hear from our last country study of today. We're going to go to Mongolia, a very different context again. We're going to hear from Mongolia. Amin, we're going to hear from Otgo Banzrak, who is from the National University of Mongolia, and from Dondol Tungalag, who is the National Coordinator of the All for Education National Civil Society Coalition of Mongolia. So over to Mongolia.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Letting me speak about this very important topic, not only in Mongolia, about the 50 countries of the world who are having such a high debt compared to the GDP, their total income, their national income, and national government budget, and everything that will affect our future in terms of education, health sector, and welfare, employment, labor market, and well-being of their country's citizens. So I will start with the debt statistics of the Mongolia and how its education financing is going on currently. Can you go to the next slide? So Mongolia is one of the countries who are having such a huge problem of the external debt, total debt. It's all, can you see on the slide that we are having, our total external debt is about 253% of the GDP, of its total GDP. It's so huge money, and it increased the last 10 years. Before 2010, we didn't have such a huge debt, but it accumulated in the last 6, 7, 8 years. So we are having the debt problem because it's growing about 4 or 5% every year compared to previous year. For example, this year, last year, 2020, the government debt grew about 12% compared to previous years. What's the reasons? It's like any other highly indebted countries in the world, like borrowing without strong economic growth, borrowing from the foreign organizations, foreign financial institutions, without backup plan how to repay the debt. So on the other hand, we are having huge problem with debt, but on the other hand, we are spending more on the education sector, luckily, but it's increasing because all about the debt. We are financing our education sector based on external debt, especially from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, also the private sector is having huge debt problem. So in the total, in the end of this process, we are having the problem in the future financing our health sector and education sector. But during this research, we found out that surprisingly, despite so fast growing external debt, the Mongolia is increasing its spending on education sector. We didn't find any correlation, negative correlation between that debt growth and the spending education sector growth. So it's a positive relationship. So it cannot continue like that. That's why we need to take a very, very kind of strong steps to decrease the debt in order to give finance education sector more sustainably in the future. Otherwise, all the increasing spending seems like dependent, based on our research of literature review, we are finding the result of this education sector financing goes to that more wealthy quantiles of the households, not the poor households, not the children in the countryside, not the children from the poor families. So that's why we need to solve the problem education financing in terms of equity and efficiency. So can you go to the next slide? So we can, So during the COVID-19, economic growth is declining, declining. So that's why it's the strong signal giving the economy and the society that the country will be unable to repay its external debt. So what's going to do the Ministry of Education, Minister of Finance? We found out from our qualitative research that from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Finance, that they are starting to work on the efficiency, effective use of the education financing in the Mongolia. But in the near future, if we won't implement this, we can't. If we want to increase our efficiency of the education financing, we will have huge problem in the future. We found out that our external, our education sector financing is mostly based on, and mostly planning is on additional external borrowing. That's why we conclude that we need to raise awareness of the growing external debt problem among the political parties, among the institutions, among the policymakers at the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Education. So in the last, on the last slide, we came out in the following the recommendations, that these recommendations would be very useful not only in Mongolia, for also for other countries who are having problem of external debt. But we need to solve very significant problems right now. The country needs to avoid default, firstly. Secondly, country avoid the decline, the education sector financing. And third, we need to, we need to implement very effective financing policy after COVID-19 will be over. We need to finance all these learning losses, school, nutrition programs among the poor, the children from the poor families. That's the three significant problems.
I don't know, Tungalag, if you wanted to say one minute, Tungalag, or are you able to?
Okay, thank you, David. And I will speak briefly about our advocacy. All for Education Coalition in Mongolia was advocating for increase of domestic financing to education since its establishment, using this 4A's framework developed by GC and Action Aid. But actually, we could not really do much on the size of the budget advocacy. So since we did this research, now we have strong evidence really to push the government to be accountable on this debt crisis. So we have planned this research launch next week, and Dr. Atta will present the findings of the research report, and we have invited some most vocal, outspoken economists invited to the launch. After follow the Atta's presentation, we will listen to some of the insights from those economists. Media is invited, so those economists and Ms. Atta also can be present on media. Minimum media channels. So really we will start our advocacy next week. This research report is translated into Mongolian and printed, so it will be distributed widely, and we will join our hands with the National Human Rights Forum NGOs and with you all to really campaign for the debt alleviation for poor countries, low-income countries. So
thank you so much. And I think that link between the research and the national advocacy is so important. The research product very important in itself, but it has to be connected then to that advocacy agenda. Then great to make that link between the Education Coalition and human rights actors. So thank you again. Now we're going to show now a very short video, which Christina is going to put up. And whilst we're doing this, showing this video, it gives the interpreter a short break. So we will go over to the video, and then we're going to get some responses from a couple of colleagues from Brazil. So let's play the video now, if we can. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you, David. This is coming a bit slow, sorry.
I like going to school because school is fun.
मैं बहुत पढ़ना चाहता हूँ और मैं सब्जी बेचना नहीं चाहता और मैं सॉफ्टवेयर इंजीनियर बनना चाहता हूँ.
Que lo que quiero ser es técnico.
Je vais à l'école pour étudier, pour réussir, pour aider mes parents quand je serai grand.
Ce que mon père fait pour moi, je veux faire plus pour mes enfants.
I wake up to see my friends not being in school. I wake up to see my younger ones not being in school, simply because there is poverty, simply because there is insecurity, simply because there is lack of funding in the education system.
La exclusión, la falta de acceso, los profesores que hace más de 10 años no han sido formados, que no están a la altura de la tecnología, presupuestos reducidos y una infraestructura ahora sí totalmente destruida.
Dans la salle où nous sommes, la première pluie, quand il a plu, nous on ne peut pas tenir de cours parce que ça suinte un peu partout. Regarde, de la classe, on peut voir le ciel.
Tenemos otro problema, el otro desafío es la gratuidad de la educación.
The challenge is the money for the registration for school and the school fees.
मेरे वालिद साहब ने कहा कि मैं घर का खर्चा बर्दाश्त करूँ तुम भाई स्कूल का. तो मेरे वालिद साहब ने कहा, मैंने वालिद साहब से कहा कि मैं एक सब्जी वाले के साथ लेबर काम करूँगा, लेकिन मैं एक लोकल स्कूल में दाखिल होगा और मैं स्कूल के अखराजात खुद उस दुकान से पे करूँगा और अपनी तनख्वाह से पे करूँगा. तो वालिद साहब ने कहा
tiene mucho trabajo infantil, ¿verdad? Niños que andan en las calles, los niños más grandes cuidando a los más pequeños, entonces estos niños no accesan al sistema educativo.
वर्ल्ड बैंक का एस्टिमेट ये है कि अराउंड 1 मिलियन बच्चा जो है 22 मिलियन ऑलरेडी आउट ऑफ स्कूल था और उसमें ये 1 मिलियन जो है ऐड हो गया है बच्चा.
जी मैं पढ़ लिख कर टीचर बनना चाहती थी. आगे कोरोना की वजह से मैं स्कूल नहीं जा रही, जिस वजह से मुझे
बच्चियाँ ज़्यादातर ड्रॉप आउट हुई हैं और ये इम्कान बहुत ज़्यादा कवी है कि बच्चियाँ वापस स्कूलों में नहीं आएंगी.
So I think it's important that we include young people in policy making and also in the decisions that we make that affect them directly.
मैं सदर से ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि जो है स्पेशल बच्चों के लिए जो है फ़न और तालीमी इदारे बनाएं और उनके लिए जो है ये कोशिश करें कि उनको भी ये फ़ंड दें और वो भी कुछ बनकर निकलें.
La mayoría de las universidades están privadas en un país donde el 70% de la población no tiene los recursos económicos para poder pagar una universidad a precios exorbitantes.
Doter les écoles en matériel, mais aussi penser un peu au personnel et la formation du personnel et ensuite la rémunération.
Se supone que el gobierno debe de garantizar una educación pública y gratuita y de calidad, pero no tenemos ni siquiera maestros en las escuelas. Señor Presidente de la República, señores donantes internacionales, necesitamos ayuda. Hoy más que nunca necesitamos ayuda.
I think it's high time for us to take education and put it in our priority list.
Los líderes mundiales y de los países que tienen mejores condiciones económicas deben de cumplir con los compromisos de ese porcentaje asignado a la educación.
La demande est forte.
Funding is very important.
Ensemble, j'ai l'habitude de le dire, on est plus fort que tous les obstacles. Ensemble, on est plus intelligent que tous les problèmes.
We must invest in our future. We must invest in children.
Podemos realmente dejar un mundo sostenible, dejar un mundo libre de guerras, libre de discriminaciones, del racismo, de los prejuicios también que existen.
Ensemble, qu'on puisse nous battre pour qu'il n'y ait plus un seul enfant qui ne sache pas lire, écrire et qui ne soit dans aucune offre éducative. C'est un droit et son effectivité doit préoccuper tout le monde.
Thank you so much for sharing that video. I think it's just a really important to remind ourselves just of the scale of the crisis facing education, and the financing of education is thus more critical to address than ever. And the impact of the debt crisis, which has been exacerbated in this period, is one that really seriously needs to be addressed if we're going to be successful in addressing the increasing crisis of education, which was pretty serious before COVID and is much more serious now. I'm going to now pass over to Ladislao Dalbar, from the Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who, as an economist, is going to give us some further reflections on debt and on what we've heard.
Well, you know, it's shocking looking at this video. You know, I am an economist, and we work with theories and things of the kind. But mostly, what we have now is indignation as what is happening. Let us give you just some basic numbers. I mean, we won't solve great things in 7 minutes, but basically, we have the money. If you take a world GDP, $88 trillion, divide by the population, 7.8 billion, this is roughly $3,800 per month per 4-member family. What we now produce in goods and services in the world is equivalent to $3,800 per 4-member family per month. So our problem is not economic. Our problem is of social and political organization. This is the real issue. Let me remind you where the money is. We call it financialization in international studies now. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, three private corporations, they are asset management corporations. They manage assets of $19.5 trillion for three private corporations, $19.5 trillion. Now, the GDP of the United States is $21 trillion. You see where the money is. I mean, this is the size of this huge financial drain on resources that should be used productively to stimulate development, to stimulate production, and to stimulate political and social policies for development. Where the money is going, we have $1.1 1% of the richest have a wealth of 45% of world wealth. Now, all this bottom of the pyramid, we're speaking of in Credit Suisse numbers, 55% of the world population has access only to 1.3% of world wealth, 1.3 for 55%. How does this happen at such a scale? Well, we have this in the studies of Thomas Piketty, Zuckman, Stiglitz, and so many others, Marjorie Kelly, and so many others. Production worldwide raises 2 or 2.5% a year. Now, financial yields, which is basically speculation, not investment, productive investment, speculative investment, yields between 7 and 9% a year. So the money goes to where it yields more for the financial groups, and it is managed by these asset management giants worldwide. Let me give you just a little sign, a feeling of this. We have so many billionaires. In Brazil, now we have Forbes analyzing the 315 billionaires in Brazil. If you have just 1 billion and you place it in a financial investment yielding 5%, very modest, you are earning $137,000 a day. On the next day, you are earning this 5% on $1 billion plus 130,000, what we call the financial snowball effect. The fatter you get, the faster you get fatter. Yes, this is a system of draining through financial intermediation, through financial speculation, of draining the resources the world needs. Now, what we need is, of course, basic income. With what I mentioned, that we produce worldwide 3,800 thousand per four-member family per month. A very moderate reduction in inequality is sufficient to ensure everybody in the world has the basic minimum. This basic minimum, one thing is money in your pocket. This is roughly 60% of family comfort, let's say, quality of life. Now, the other 40% is social policies. You need security, but you do not buy police, or should not buy police. Yes, you do not buy hospitals, you do not buy schools. All these systems are much cheaper, much more effective when they are of free access, universal access as public services. This is how it works in so many countries, and it is cheaper and more effective. It's not just Finland, it is so many countries throughout the world. Take health in Canada, take decentralization of financial systems in China. In so many countries, these things work. And education is a key issue. If you take this inequality to Brazil, I mean, we are a main exporter in the world of food. Now we have 19 million people going hungry, yes, and 116 have food insecurity. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't food. Yes? I mean, what education can you speak of? At the same time, we have these billionaires growing richer at a very, very impressive rate. We have a major World Bank, which is Banco Itaú in Brazil. It's a huge corporation. In 12 months, with the pandemic, it raised its profits in 120%. Santander in Brazil raised its profit by 102%. Our problem is not lack of resources. It's not lack of technology. It is not lack of knowing what we have to do. It is this kind of impotence in the face of a system that is draining. I have this book, Pedro Rossi also say I made propaganda for my book, but this is very good. The Age of Unproductive Capital. You must understand the drain, because David, we know what should be done. The hell is the money going elsewhere, and it's going to people who are not productive, who are destroying our planet in environment issues, and are destroying our population and are destroying our children. When I take this 19 million people going hungry in Brazil, 25% of them are children. Well, you have no food for children. You imagine the situation of the parents. I mean, what are we talking about? This is essentially a scandal. But just finishing, the opportunity is that knowledge, once you fund its development, you can spread it worldwide on the internet free of charge, and you can enrich through knowledge so many people without additional costs. I mean, this is the obvious issue. I have my website. I publish all my books free of charge online. People are very happy, but we must spread this worldwide. Right? Knowledge is a commons.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do put your website in the chat box. It reminds me of the work of Paul Mason, Post-Capitalism, which talks about how knowledge becomes, is inherently free and transformative when we take that seriously and work with it. So thank you so much, Ladislau. And please do share further details. And Christina's also shared a study on Brazil in the chat already, but do share other publications. We're going to pass over now to Pedro Rossi, who's the Professor of Economics and Head of Austerity Observatory at the University of Campinas in Brazil. Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. Well, not everyone here in Brazil, it's good morning for you. For some of you, it's good evening. So I'm gonna do a general comment and then raise some questions to the presenters, the speakers. And I'd like to thank the host for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to participate in such event. I think this research are very, very important that highlight national specificities, the country levels. That is very, very important. I think we have to deal with that in specific case, historical case, and not in general cases. And this perspective is very important. So it's very good for us, for academics, for policy recommendation to have this kind of studies at country level. I'm going to bring here a perspective from our research group, which works a lot with fiscal policy and human rights. We participate in an initiative that is called Fiscal Policy for Human Rights. I'm going to share with you in the group. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we don't talk only about debt. We talk about debt, but we also talk about deficit, and we also talk about spending and taxation. And when we bring this perspective, we can see that debt has two sides. Debt is not good or bad by nature. Debt must not have a moralistic view about it. So to cancel foreign debt, for example, can be very important for a country development. But also to cancel, for example, national debt may have negative consequences for a country, because there is a thing called deficit that is very important for financing education sometimes, mainly in times of crisis, when we have a drop in government receipts. You can use debt, and it's not a bad thing to use debt, to increase debt is not a bad thing always. So what I'm trying to bring here is that in one hand, the debt cancellation may be necessary in specific cases, and on the other hand, it is essential to preserve for national governments the ability, the capacity to finance spending through deficit when it needed. Of course, a deficit is not a better way to finance education. For me, the best way to finance education is through direct taxes on income and wealth, and through progressive income brackets. this is the best way to finance education. But sometimes you don't have these resources. So you have to use debt to finance education. See, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do a debt cancellation, a debt alleviation. I'm saying that it has to side, and we have to look the historical cases, the specificity of each country, so that we can tell that this country is it's a country that we have to do this kind of policy. Here in Brazil, we had, David, we went to the IMF in the 80s, in the 90s. We did a necessary debt cancellation because we have a foreign debt crisis. And so we know a lot of this agenda, the Washington Consensus agenda. But right now, the case of Brazil is not a matter of debt cancellation, surely not. As Ladislau said, we do not have the lack of resources. We do not have the lack of foreign resources. We have the resources. We have a problem of austerity, which sometimes is justified because the debt has increased. So our problem in Brazil is the debt ceiling, the spending ceiling that we have that avoid the resources for education. Our problem is not that. What we want in Brazil is just to do a deficit, so to increase debt in the short run, so we can do the social protection. So in other cases, in the 80s, in the 90s, we had to do a debt cancellation, and it was right to do it in that time, not now. So what I'm trying to say here, that we have this both hands and both two sides of the same story that we have to consider. And it's so important. It's important to remind that education, unlike other social area as health, it doesn't need much of foreign resources like to buy equipment, to buy medicines like health, to buy machines. So education, it can be financed with the internal resources. So Brazil does not have a lack of resources. It has inequality. So the resources are not distributed as we would like. So we have the resources to finance education. So what I'm trying to bring here is the two sides of the same question. So it's very important to discuss not only the size of the debt, but also its composition. If it's a domestic debt, if it's a foreign debt, if it's in national currency, if it's in dollars or other currency. So this qualitative analysis is very important to approach the issue of debt for us. So considering this, I'm going to finish with some question for the presenters. We have seen in the very interesting presentation, for example, the case of Lebanon, that debt service costs more than twice the education budget. So we really have a case here and in other countries. So it would be interesting to go deeper in some points for the presenters. The following question, for example, what is the composition of public debt between national and foreign currency? Will canceling the debt in some cases affect the government's ability to finance education through deficits? This is an important question. And finally, is there any room to raise funds through taxes, for example, from the richest, for income taxes, from health taxes? So these three questions try to meet my argument here, and it would be nice to hear you from this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro. And I think it's absolutely that choice that, in a sense, every country has to either pursue politics and this cult of austerity, or to expand tax bases in a progressive and fair way in order to finance a sort of expansion of public services. We've always been presented for so long with the idea that there is no alternative, when we know very clearly that there are alternatives, and that it's actually a political, an ideological choice in many cases. I think your questions relating to the balance of national and international debt are things which need to be looked at very seriously in each country, and I hope can inform the sort of next phase of research, because it's a really important distinction. I do want to just pick up a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. In fact, there's one question from the audience here, which is from Katarina Popovic about, and I think it's probably directed to Ladislav Doba about should we focus on the political fight then, on changing the global political architecture? Is that really where we need to be putting our efforts?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Katerina, I think we absolutely have to change we call it the social and political architecture. It is the decision process. For example, you take Brazil, the municipalities, we have more than 5,000 municipalities. They are in charge of basic education. They don't have the money. The money stayed at the top. So we have to ensure this is organized. I think this bottom-up organization of society is absolutely essential. We must, at the local level, people can organize better. They can participate better, so they can get the control on what is happening better. Now, a key issue is rescuing control of money. If you go to Germany, the Germans do not put their money in banks. They put their money in Sparkassen, local loan system, and the money keeps under the management of the community. This is how it works in so many other countries. In Brazil, we already have 140 community development banks. So controlling the money and getting back control on politics are absolutely key issues. And let me tell you that everybody is looking for a new system, because this system, particularly with its financialization, worldwide financialization, is simply not working. You'll find this in so many discussions. Inclusively, we're participating very much on the discussions with Pope Francesco on the new economic structures that we need. We are looking for, this is a civilization crisis. It's not just a pinpoint education crisis.
Absolutely, and it does seem to me that the most exciting stuff now is that coming together of the education movements with health and other public service movements, with the tax and fiscal justice movements, with those working on that. There needs to be a real convergence of different forces to be propositional about alternatives.
Absolutely.
To turn briefly to Heidi, because she has to leave very shortly, and just to ask, in the context of the present inadequacy of the debt suspension initiative of the G20, what can be done to push the G7, G20 to go further? And how do we advance the case for a UN debt workout mechanism, which will take the debt, which will diminish the power of the IMF, which is, I think, really one of the critical concerns here. Any immediate reflections on that, Heidi?
Yeah, I think the G20 are sitting on its laurels. I think they're satisfied with the debt suspension scheme. They're satisfied with the G20 common framework for debt treatments. And so from their point of view, they feel they've done their bit to deal with the debt crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, both of those schemes are completely inadequate for the scale of the crisis that we're going to see across the global south. And so I think it's down to us as campaigners, as civil society groups, to keep exposing the inconsistencies within both of these programs. And in particular, what both things have in common is this lack of method or a lack of mechanism, to compel the private creditors to come to the table, because while they continue to get away scot-free and are not participating in any form of debt restructuring or debt relief, it means that any debt relief that is happening from other governments, that it's essentially a public subsidy to going directly into the pockets of private banks, private corporations, and so so it undermines the whole approach. So I think that we need to continue doing that. And in the UK, we have been running a campaign actually exposing the role of private creditors in the debt crisis. We're using that as a way to demonstrate how the sheer injustice of this situation. Ideally, we would want private creditors to come to the table, but ultimately we do need we need a completely different architecture on how we deal with debt. And this idea of a debt workout mechanism that is convened by the UN means that countries that do go into debt crisis have a fair and a transparent process that they can undergo in which to renegotiate their debt, to reconstruct their debt so that it's at sustainable levels to enable them to be able to meet the human rights of their citizens and ensure that they can prioritize the rights to health, the rights to education, the rights to food, as we've talked about, the rights to clean air, all those kind of really basic human rights, and to have a decent life need to be prioritized over the profiteering of private creditors.
Thank you so much, Heidi. I've got a final question for Pedro, which relates to one of my favorite topics, which is how the indebtedness leaves countries vulnerable to the IMF, whose policy advice is so consistently to coerce countries into austerity, and particularly one of the flagship policies, the holding down the public sector spending, and specifically the public sector, the spending on the public sector wage bill. For education workers, this is absolutely pivotal because the 90% of education budgets tends to go on teachers. So if you have constraints on your wage bill, and if teachers are the largest group on the wage bill, and the majority of education spending goes on wages, this directly leads to cuts in spending on education. That's one of the most tangible ways in which that is. How can countries stand up to the politics of austerity imposed by the IMF? How can countries, civil society work to persuade ministries of finance to pursue alternatives, knowing that there are alternatives out there?
David, this is a very interesting question, and it has two answers, actually, because austerity policy can be imposed by the IMF in several countries, but in the case of Brazil, it's imposed from ourselves, because we don't have the IMF here. We are creditor, net creditor in foreign currencies, so we have 350 billions in reserves, so we don't need the IMF. But actually, we put the agenda of the IMF forwards. Here in Brazil, we are talking about paying a bill from the pandemic. I don't know if you are familiar with this kind of argument. So we did the spending. Now it's time to pay the spending, and to pay the spending is to reduce debt and to reduce also spending. So this is completely false, because it has nothing to do with the dynamic of macroeconomics. We don't need to reduce debt. The public debt is not like a private debt that you have to pay the next day. So you have the case of England after the World War, that we have 250% in the relation debt-GDP. And what they did after the World War, they did an austerity plan to cut spending. No, they didn't this. They just constructed the welfare state, and they elevate spending, public spending. And the debt went down, not because they were paying it, but because GDP was growing up. So what we have to do, it's actually to look forward growth, to look for the employment. So we have to, in the short run, we will run deficits, and in the long run, we have to finance this by taxation. So this is the way. So we have to tell the IMF that we have to first put the economy to run and then to pay debt. So this is the way fiscal policy work, and not the way they talk actually to us, and they recommend austerity to, actually now they are not recommend austerity to rich countries, to poor countries. They are doing this.
Exactly. In fact, there's a contradictory advice out there now about expansionary spending in rich countries, but poor countries told that they have to cut. You're absolutely right. It's not just about the IMF. It's also an ideology internalized by ministries of finance acutely in many, many countries. In our latest report on the public versus austerity, we talk about the cult of austerity. There's fewer and fewer people who adhere to that cult, but the trouble is that they're in very powerful positions in the IMF and ministries of finance. And there's revolving doors between ministries of finance and the IMF and the World Bank, which means you've got a very closed debate and people aren't open to the alternatives. And that sense of alternative seems to me to be pivotal, that we need to be looking at how investment in the public sector and in the public services, and particularly in frontline workforce, contributes to economic growth and development, that actually it's a positive cycle. And the logic of investment in public services as part of a positive cycle of growth and development seems to have been lost, and is something we need to reassert. I think as an education community, we need to be engaging in those strategic debates in a much more articulate way than we've been able to up until now. But I think the education movement, the Global Campaign for Education, and all of the national coalitions that are members of it are incredibly well placed to make some of those connections. And so it's a great privilege to have the former president of the Global Campaign for Education joining us to give us some closing remarks. Camilla Crosso, now the Education Director with Open Society Foundations. Over to you for some closing remarks from what's been a fascinating session. Camilla.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, everyone. It really was a huge pleasure to be part of this panel today, to hear from colleagues in Lebanon, Zambia, Mongolia, our colleagues in Brazil, the two economists with us that joined us, and everyone else who joined this panel, and you, David, of course. A few reflections that drew my attention very much in the conversation today. First, the remarks that Pedro gave regarding the qualitative analysis of debt, I think really speaks to the spirit of these researches that were carried out. The intent of these researches was precisely to look more qualitatively, to look comparatively, to really try and understand from within the composition, the nuances, how they really interplay. So I want to start by underlining that and congratulating GC for the approach. And I think that, it's interesting that, Ladislav brings to our attention that we do have the money. So, and all of you, the way that we have articulated the conversation today, it is very clear that we need to tackle not only the debt crisis, but the struggle for tax justice and the struggle around the cult of austerity together. So these three, let's say, elements to rethink another economy seems to me fundamental. And this challenge of understanding that it is really a political decision what we do with the economy, and bringing the political dimension to the forefront, and making sure that finally we manage to put forward an economy that is at the service of the people. So the interplay of the economy, of social welfare, social well-being, and politics is fundamental. Going to Katerina's questions of really, is it a political decision? How is it that we manage to turn it around to put forward another paradigm, another economic paradigm? And the two colleagues that spoke today were two economists who bring to the table a completely different perspective on the economy. Seems to me fundamental. The COVID crisis really does, the narrative and the language that we have heard during the COVID crisis, really personifying the economy as if we had to put the health of the economy, as if the economy was a being, a living being. I think it really has to catch our attention, and we cannot not naturalize this whatsoever. So actually the health of the economy and the personification of the economy being placed over and above the lives of people and is violent. And I think that we need to really look through a lens of violence. And inequity and inequality is violent, and really turning it around and making the economy be at the service of ensuring dignity and human rights for all and really an equitable world is what we have to do. And finally, just to say that this dialogue between the education community and between colleagues who are economists is really something urgent. And I'm so happy that we have taken forward this dialogue and look forward to much more. Thank you so much, everyone. Over to you, David.
Well, I think yours is supposed to be the closing remarks, actually, Camilla. So I think that probably does bring us to a conclusion. And it's just left with me to say thank you to everyone who participated today. I think thank you to the Global Campaign for Education for organising this, for bringing this together and bringing colleagues from Zambia and Mongolia. And I think it's been absolutely, and Lebanon, of course, it's been, I think, really interesting. And there's such a potential to do more work in this area, both as the Global Campaign for Education, for the regional coalitions, for national coalitions, and to reach out to other constituencies and other movements. I'm certainly conscious myself of how much the education community is now connecting to those wider strategic finance issues around tax justice, around resisting austerity, taking action for debt justice as well. And we just need to do more of this at every level and bring together the different actors as much as we can in each case. So I think this is just the start. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the final versions of each of the national research reports. And I hope that the research and advocacy at national level can drive change at national level, and then collectively can enhance our understanding of what needs to be done regionally and globally. If there is going to be a moment of change after 40 years of neoliberalism, it has to be now. It has to be seizing the moment of the COVID crisis, which has been so disruptive in so many. And when in the face of the climate crisis and the most important climate conference, which is happening, in Glasgow from next week, if you don't revisit the global economic model, and if you don't revisit the pivotal role of public services, we are not going to take action on the scale needed to address the climate crisis. So every single one of these crises, whether it's the crisis in inequality, in the crisis in climate, or the crisis from COVID, all point in the same direction, that this is the moment to rethink, radically rethink, the global economic order which has held down public spending over the last 40 years. I hope we can achieve that. It's really quite time sensitive, because if you don't seize the moment when the moment is presented, it can be very difficult to advance change after that. So I think we have a lot of work to do in the next few weeks, months and years together. And thank you again to everyone who's participated today and everyone who helped to organise it. And really appreciate all of the contributions. Take care, and let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.